Welcome to Day 3 of DynamicsCon. We hope you are feeling the power of community from the first 2 days, filled with learning and networking. Thank you to our sponsors for making this event entirely free. Now let's gear up for an adventurous final day of DynamicsCon. Please welcome our first speaker of the day in the Power Platform track, Grant Bartholomew, a senior software engineer. Today he will be presenting Power Automate tips, best practices, and lessons learned. Please stick around after Grant's session for a live Q&A.
All right, good morning everyone, and thank you for joining me for my DynamicsCon presentation on Power Automate tips, best practices, and lessons learned. And a big thank you to the DynamicsCon team for putting this together and having me present today. And of course, a big thank you to anyone who voted for my session, if you did. I am Grant Bartholomew. I am a technical solution engineer for a Microsoft Gold partner. I have been working with Power Automate for a few years now, which is much of its existence given how new the technology is. Here is my contact info on the screen. I am always open to talk to or connect with anyone. My background is in Dataverse, so many of the examples we go through today will be based around Dataverse, but the principles and topics we discuss will be applicable to any and every flow you may create. And if anyone's confused, Dataverse is Microsoft's new terminology for what used to be called CDS, or Common Data Service. Before that, CE, or Customer Engagement, and before that, CRM. So lots of terminology changes. I know it can be confusing. I certainly get confused sometimes as well. So here are a few other terminology changes that Microsoft has made recently. Just want to put these up there to make sure we're all on the same page. What used to be called entities are now tables. Fields are now columns, records are now rows. So Microsoft kind of changing the terminology to better align with how the data is stored in the database. And those last two we will not really talk about at all today. First, I'd like to set the agenda. So we will start with a brief introduction of Power Automate, kind of what it is and how it can help you and or your organization, and talk through some examples of flows that I've built for clients. Next, we will go over best practices that I've learned over the past few years of developing flows. We will then review the two CDS connectors, because there are two, and I know that is a source of great confusion for many people. And yes, CDS, Dataverse, same thing. They have not changed the terminology on those connectors, at least as of the time of this recording. We will then take kind of everything that we've learned and talk through and do a deeper dive of an all-encompassing example of a recent flow that I built for a client. And in that flow, we will also go over the parent-child flow design paradigm, which is incredibly useful and can be tricky to build. So that will be helpful, hopefully, to a lot of people. And then I want to end by talking over some of the upcoming or new Power Automate enhancements in the most recent releases, just to give us an idea of where Microsoft will be taking this technology. And of course, we will have a Q&A session at the end, and I will be available live, so if you have any questions, just drop a question in the chat and I will answer as best as I can. What is Power Automate? And before we dive in, I want to give my two main takeaways from today's session. First and foremost, this is accessible and useful for everyone. You don't need a background in software development. You don't need a background in Dataverse. Microsoft has done a great job at making this tool useful for anyone and everyone. This presentation, we will cover basics, some advanced topics, and everywhere in between. So don't be intimidated by anything we go over today. The second takeaway is the possibilities with Power Automate are nearly endless. So use your creativity. It is an incredibly powerful tool and only continues to become more powerful with each release. Power Automate is Microsoft's low-code, no-code solution for process automation. Here are two screenshots from some Microsoft documentation. On the left, we can see Power Automate sits squarely in the middle of Microsoft's other product offerings. And on the right is a screenshot I took of what you see when you are creating a flow. Two things I want to point out from that screenshot. First, you can see there's the option to start from a template, and I find these incredibly helpful. Whether you're a beginner, expert, or anywhere in between, those can be incredibly useful. And then under the build your own from blank, we see there are 5 options. Those first 3 are cloud flows, which is what we will be covering today, and that is what people typically mean when they refer to flows. And of course, you have automated, so trigger based on a specified event. Instant, you manually kick it off yourself. And scheduled, which could be daily, weekly, hourly, etc. Then you also have the desktop flows, which is Microsoft's robotic process automation tool, and business process flows, which sit in the Dataverse. So 3 important terms to know when talking about flows and Power Automate are connectors, triggers, and actions. Connectors you can think of as your data sources and your data destinations. This, of course, includes Microsoft products, Teams, SharePoint, Outlook, OneNote, OneDrive, Power BI, Excel, etc., and a ton of non-Microsoft products. So you have social media with Twitter, Facebook, you've got DocuSign, GitHub, Google Drive, etc. There are just under 200 free connectors, and there are over 200 premium connectors, and there are more being added every month. Triggers, that is simply the event that causes your flow to run. So an example from the Outlook connector is when an email is received. So if you receive an email to your Outlook email inbox, you can trigger a flow based on that. And then actions is simply what your flow does, the logic of your flow. Here is a screenshot of some of the connectors. This is, of course, not all-encompassing, but I just wanted to give you all an example of what is possible and to kind of show you that these connectors don't have to be thought of as only traditional data sources. There is a lot of variability in these. So how can you get started with Power Automate? You go to that website there, us.flow.microsoft.com, and I would recommend just starting with a template. Again, I find these incredibly useful, so I would go in there, look through the templates, open one up that sounds interesting to you, or open up a couple, and then you can modify or add on to that as needed and customize it for your needs. Here is an example template. This template sends a message to a Teams channel whenever an item is created in SharePoint. So this template, as you can see, utilizes 2 connectors, SharePoint Online for that first block, and then Microsoft Teams for that second. And of course, the first one is our trigger, and the second is our action. Of course, you can add more actions or modify this as needed. Next, I want to go over some of these real-life examples of flows that I've built for clients recently. Again, to give everyone some ideas of what is possible with Power Automate and get everyone's wheels spinning, thinking about how you can utilize this for yourself or your organization. Approval processes is a very common use case for Power Automate, and for good reason. I mean, how often do we see companies using old, burdensome approval processes? You can think of having to print out a document, physically signing it, walk it over to your coworker, have them sign it. If they're not there, you got to come back 30 minutes later to find them or track them down, and then maybe you even have to upload that back into your computer, scan it as a PDF, etc. So there's really no reason to be doing that in this day and age. Flow makes it so easy to design and implement approval processes that are secure, easy to monitor, to kind of track where they stand, and not onerous for your users. So 2 recent examples that I've built. One is an approval process for documents that starts in SharePoint. So users upload the document to SharePoint, work on it, and once they think it's ready, they manually kick off the flow, which will send an email to the approver or approvers with details of the document and a link to the document and buttons to click approve or reject. And then based on the type of document and, of course, the decision, the appropriate action is taken and the requester is notified of the decision. The second interesting example recently that I built is an approval process for orders that started in the Dataverse. So once a sales rep has a quote ready, again, they click a button to manually start this flow, and it will send the customer an email utilizing the DocuSign connector. And once the customer rather, signs that document in DocuSign, the flow will automatically create a sales order in both Dataverse and in the D365 finance and operations environment. Second one is Flow makes it very easy to kind of aggregate data, collect data for reporting. Not only simple reporting, but again, manipulate the data, even run statistical models on it, etc. So a recent example that I built for this was we had a client, a customer service manager, who every day was manually going into Dataverse, and he had a specific view that he used, and he would export these cases to Excel and then manually create reports based on that. So we worked with him, and we were able to automate this, so we would do it every day, and then he'll have it automatically in his OneDrive ready to go with the reports that he needs. And of course, this does not have to be from the data source. Really, anything that has a connector, this can be a very powerful tool for aggregating data and reporting based on that. Next, you can schedule updates for system activity, again, both in the Dataverse or any system. So an example of this that we built recently is for a client who the VP of sales and the CFO wanted to kind of understand what sales activity was happening every day in their Dataverse system. So we built an automated flow to trigger every morning and send an email to them that would give a kind of snapshot of the sales activity in the Dataverse system. What opportunities were closed as won or lost, which opportunities were not touched throughout the day, etc. And last, but certainly not least, Flow is a very powerful tool for making bulk data updates in Dataverse. There are, of course, many tools for doing this. Flow is one of the most powerful, especially if you have any sort of complex logic in how you're updating that data. And this is really only scratching the surface of what Power Automate could do. We could spend a whole session talking through use cases for Power Automate. Next, I want to go through 5 best practices that I have learned from developing flows over the past few years. I've learned these the hard way, so pay attention so you can learn the easy way and not repeat my mistakes. Do not start until you have a complete design plan. This is really best practice for any task or any project, but I find it even more important for building flows, because if you're working in a flow and midway through you try to start making changes, there's a decent chance that you will run into some weird errors and may even end up having to start over completely. A recent example of this is I was building a flow and realized, hey, I should put this in a child flow because this logic can be reused. Tried to make that change, the whole thing blew up. I had to create a new flow and kind of migrate that logic over. So kind of created a headache for me that could have been avoided had I followed this best practice. Secondly, name your steps. This, of course, makes it easier to read, maintain, and make updates to your flow, but it also has the non-obvious effect of if you try to make changes midway through, again, some dependent actions may fail. So in this example here, in this screenshot, you can imagine this apply to each maybe is applying to each item returned from that list rows action. So if you go into this flow and try to change that name, maybe from list rows to list contacts or whatever, that apply to each, will be looking for a list rows action and will of course not find one because you changed the name, and it will fail. And this photo is of course an example of what not to do, because if you read through this, it's really impossible to tell what this flow is trying to do. So if you need to go in and make updates at a later date, it's going to be way harder for yourself. So name your steps, name them immediately. You'll thank me, or you'll thank yourself rather for doing that. Third is implement error handling. It cannot be overstated how important and how powerful this is in Power Automate. And it's really not intuitive to do. So I'm going to walk through a quick example of how to do this. So after the step in the flow that you are worried may fail, add your error handling step. In this case here, we can see that we are sending an email that the flow failed. You can send that to yourself, to a system administrator, or to user kicked off the flow, etc. Click on the ellipses for that step and go to Configure Run After. And you'll be presented with these options. By default, of course, one step follows the next after the previous step is successful. But what we want to do is change that to has failed. So the way this reads now is run a child flow, account live deal flag, and then if that fails, run our send an email that the flow failed. And then importantly, if we have steps after that, we need to do the same configure run after, but we want to select is skipped. So the way this reads in total is run a child flow, count live deal flag. If that fails, send an email that the flow failed. If not, that email step will be skipped and it will move on to the second email step of emailing the sales manager to let them know. Next, this kind of comes from just Development 101. Variables are your friend. Again, helps with readability, maintenance, making updates, but it also has the effect of making your flows easier to debug. Because if you're walking through a flow execution, it's much easier to see where values stand midway through the flow. Last, certainly not least, optimize your flows. Again, kind of just Development 101. So make them as efficient as possible so that they only trigger when necessary, and on retrieve records, only get the records and the columns that you need. So now I'll go over these two connectors, the CDS current environment connector and the CDS connector. And hope so. The CDS current environment connector is the new one, and that's what you see on the left here. And the old one, the CDS connector, is on the right. And these are screenshots of the triggers that are available in each. So two things I want to point out here. One being on the right with that old connector, you can see when a record is created, deleted, or updated. Those are three different triggers. So if you need to trigger a flow when a record is either created or updated, you're going to have to create two flows if you use that old CDS connector. Where on the left you can see that second one, when a row is created, updated, or deleted, is one trigger, and you can of course configure that to run on just one of those three, two of them, or all three. So that's easily configurable. The second thing I want to point out is that old CDS connector does have one big advantage over the current environment connector, which is that third one right there, the when a record is selected. And that is the trigger that allows users to go into Dataverse, select a record or multiple records, and then manually trigger a flow. If I had to guess, I would assume that Microsoft will eventually add that to the current environment connector as well, because again, that's the new one. That's the one they are continually updating and putting all their work into. So I would expect to see that there at some point. Again, you can see the one on the left, the new one, has the updated terminology using when a row is created, updated or deleted, whereas the old one still has not been updated yet. Also want to go through the actions for these two connectors. On the right, the old connector, you really only have your basic CRUD operations: create, read, update, and delete. Of course, with read, you have get record and list record, so get one or multiple. But then on the left, you have all sorts of options available to you, much more powerful than the old CDS connector. And one I wanted to point out is that predict one, second from the bottom, which is a way to tap into Microsoft's AI capabilities, which they are investing heavily in and making a big push in their AI. So next I want to take a lot of what we've just discussed and kind of take a deep dive into a flow that I had created for a client recently. I modified the requirements and the flow specifically for this presentation. Well, I simplified it quite a bit, and I added a little just to demonstrate some of the topics we covered today. So the example scenario we have is the VP of sales comes to you and he needs a way to easily identify and report based on which accounts are being actively engaged, which accounts have a live deal associated with them. After some back and forth, you come to an understanding that an account is considered to be actively engaged if there's an active opportunity or quote associated with that account in the Dataverse system. Now that we understand our requirements, what's our first step as good flow developers? Before we start development, of course, plan our full flow design. So there are really two things we need to consider. First is if an opportunity or quote is created or made active, we of course need to mark that account that it has a live deal associated with it. On the flip side, if an opportunity or quote is deactivated, we can't simply mark the account that it does not have a live deal. We have to check to see if there's another active record for that account. Users, you can assume, do not delete records because they don't have access and that's not their business process. So you're thinking this through and you realize you're going to need two flows at least. You will need one for opportunities and one for quotes, but you can put a lot of the reusable logic into a child flow. So you will have your child flow with most of your logic, and then a parent flow to trigger on opportunities, and a parent flow to trigger on quotes. The first one you build is the child flow. So here is a complete bird's eye view of that child flow, and if anything is confusing, don't worry, I'm going through this step by step, starting with the trigger. So if you want a child flow, you need to make the trigger manually trigger a flow. And you can also pass inputs into your child flow, which is incredibly useful. For our situation here, we are passing two inputs, just the account ID of the account in Dataverse and a Boolean yes, no flag indicating whether that opportunity or quote that triggered the flow is active. So next up, we see we have our condition if record is active. So of course, if our opportunity or quote is active, we just need to make sure the account is set to yes, that it has a live deal. We respond to the parent with the success status, and then we can terminate the flow. One note here is we could have, of course, instead of terminating here on the if yes statement, we could have put the rest of our logic in the if no statement. I like to do this instead when at all possible, because if you have too many conditions and you try and put too many things inside the conditions, your flow can be kind of messy, bulky, and hard to read. Even if you have just two nested conditionals, it can become very, very tricky to understand very quickly. So let's zoom back out here. Next up, we see if the record is not active, we search to see if there is an active opportunity or if there is an active quote associated with that. And you can see best practice of optimizing our flow. I configured these to run in parallel rather than sequentially because there is no need to wait for one to finish before executing the second. Zoom in on those two actions. We can see again our best practices. One is in that select query. We're only selecting the rows or fields that are needed. And then secondly, that top count we have set to 1. And that's telling the flow only grab maximum of one record, because of course we don't care if there's 1, 2, 10 or 100 active opportunities. As long as there's one, at least, we need to set the account to active. If we zoom back out here, we see our final steps are checking to see if we returned anything, and then responding to our flow. So the way I like to check if we received anything from our list rows is using this empty function. So if they are both empty, we of course set the account flag to no to indicate it does not have a live deal associated with it. Otherwise, we set it to yes. And lastly, of course, we respond to the parent flow with our success status. And that is necessary to indicate that this is a child flow that can be called from other flows. And that step also has the benefit that you can pass data back to the parent flow if needed. For our purposes, we are really just sending back the success status. Lastly, we're going to take a look at one of the parent flows because the other one is, of course, exactly the same. So this is the opportunity parent flow. And first here, we're looking at the trigger. Again, best practices, we use our filtering attributes so that this flow only triggers when the state code is updated on the opportunity or when an opportunity is created. Because it doesn't matter to us, again, if the contact on the opportunity changes or the potential dollar amount associated changes. We really only care whether it is active or inactive. And then we initialize our variable, whether the opportunity is active or not, and then we run our child flow, and then it's worth one more look at our error handling because that is best practice, and again, it's very, very useful. So we can see here again on the left, our failure step we configure to run after the prior step has failed, and then the next email we run only if that failure step is skipped. And the last thing I want to do today is talk through some of the new and upcoming enhancements to Power Automate that Microsoft is pushing out, just to give everyone an idea of where Microsoft is taking this technology. Part of Microsoft 2020 Release Wave 2 or 2021 Release Wave 1. And this is only a fraction of the new pieces that are coming in these releases. So it shows just how quickly this technology is evolving and how much work Microsoft is putting into this to make it more and more powerful. So first here, batch operations in Dataverse, making it much easier to perform bulk updates. Secondly, further integration with Teams. Teams is, of course, a huge strategic push for Microsoft, so I expect they'll only continue to invest in the Teams connector and add more capabilities going forward. Next is search records and Dataverse using relevance search. At the time of this recording, this is not available, but on the date of the conference, this will be available for early preview. So this can help users who don't want to kind of build out a specific query syntax. You can kind of use relevance search instead. Next, they have made a lot of enhancements to desktop flows, which are those robotic process automation tools that Microsoft has that we mentioned earlier but did not cover today. That is also a very powerful tool that can benefit pretty much anyone. They're making a ton of enhancements to the user experience in general, making it easier to sign up and to onboard, clarifying some of the licensing questions because it is very confusing, the licensing for Power Automate. They're adding some admin tools to help track your flows in terms of API usage, failures by flow and by user, etc. So I expect they will continue to make this user experience easier and easier for both beginners and for kind of people with software development background. Next, they're adding a new trigger to the CDS current environment connector that is when a Dataverse action is called. So that should be incredibly useful. And lastly, they have a new tool that right now is in preview called Product Advisor. That is a new product offering from Microsoft, and it is a tool to help document, understand, and analyze your business processes. So it can help you find choke points in your processes where something is getting held up, helps you share and collaborate within your team or amongst other teams at your company, and ultimately reduce waste in your business processes. And with that, I want to say thank you again to everyone for joining me, and thank you again to DynamicsCon for hosting this and allowing me to present here today. And I will open it up for questions. Again, here is my contact info. Please do not hesitate. Reach out to me, an email, or connect on LinkedIn. I will be more than happy to talk with you about Dynamics or Power Platform questions or needs. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you to DynamicsCon, of course, for setting this up. They did an amazing job, and thank you so much to Justin, my coworker, who has agreed to moderate my session here. And Justin,
Here I am.
Justin, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me, Grant?
Perfect. Yes. And everyone should make sure to check out Justin's session, which is immediately following this one on the customer engagement track. Justin, you want to give a quick blurb about your session?
Yeah, so it's just going to be basically an introduction to technical development within Dynamics CE. So if you are a budding developer, if you're interested in learning more about the technical development side of Dynamics CE, then make sure to check it out.
Great. And with that, we'll dive into some of these questions here. I think we got a lot of good questions in the chat. So appreciate everyone being engaged, and a lot of them were answered by other attendees, which is great to see.
Mm-hmm. So we do have one question from Heidi. Heidi asks, have you found approvals to be the quick win for companies looking to start with Power Automate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's a great place to start. The approvals are incredibly helpful, and that's a lot of clients are looking for approval solutions. And as with everything in Power Automate, the solutions get better and better every day. So they keep adding on to the approvals, keep adding further integrations to make it easier and easier and more powerful. So yes, I think, Heidi, that's a great place to start.
Okay, cool. And Chad Althus wanted to ask, when are you using child flows?
Yeah, it's another great question. I'd say really anytime that you have a block of logic that you think might be reused, either in another flow or in another, just a block of logic that can be reused. It's helpful to kind of put that in its own flow to then, if you need to make changes to it, if you've got the same logic in multiple flows, you've got to make it twice. And if you have it in a child flow, it gives you some flexibility. So yes, I would say child flows really anytime you have reusable block of logic.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And yeah, I just wanted to put in something. There's actually one issue that I have with child flows that I found is that you can't actually trigger like multiple instances of a child flow passing in different data like at the same time. And so one way that I have found to work around that is instead of using the actual like child flow connector within Flow, what I do sometimes with my child flow is I will create a new flow that is triggered by an HTTP request. And then I can trigger the HTTP request in my parent flow as many times as I want, passing in whatever data. And so you can basically have a bunch of different child flows running parallel to each other at the same time if you do that.
Yes, thank you for that. The HTTP request to trigger a flow is very powerful, very useful, I'd say.
And then we have a question from Nick on parallel runs. Will the step after a parallel run wait for everything to finish before it runs?
Yes, if you have two side by side and then one afterward, the two that are side by side will have to finish before the step below it starts execution.
And then Nick also asked, when you return from a conditional, do the remaining steps know what path the conditional was taken?
That's a great question. You can set up a variable to kind of keep track of what the result is, and then use that down the line. I think that would be your easiest way. Easiest way there. I assume you're talking outside of the conditional block. In which case, that would be an easy way to get that functionality.
Yeah. Several people noted that they were interested in learning a little bit more about Product Advisor. Do you have any more information on that new offering?
I do not have too much more. They don't have, at least at the time of the recording, much documentation out there about Product Advisor, but Microsoft certainly will put out more information as they have it. So that is something I'm certainly excited to learn about more as they build that out.
Mm-hmm. And I have a question for you. So you are a developer, and obviously I'm a developer too. What have you felt have been like the biggest things that you wish Flow had that programming does that Flow just doesn't have yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. How long you got? Because there are a lot of shortcomings compared to standard, programming language. Let's say some of the biggest are really kind of simple things in terms of, if you're building a large flow, you can have your flow get pretty cumbersome pretty quickly. We've got a lot of different blocks, and if you've got nested conditionals, it's taking up more space than you really have on your screen, etc. So I'd say it's really for kind of larger flows. It just becomes a little cumbersome. What do you think, Justin? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah. So one issue would be regular expressions. So if I ever want to do any kind of actually complex string parsing, then Flow is pretty much right out of the equation, unless I want to pay for some premium connector that someone else built. So that's a personal issue with mine that I've come up with a few times. And then also array sorting, kind of sorting a collection of objects, has never been very easy within Flow. So hopefully that's something that someone will work on in the future.
Yeah, you can see some shortcomings even with pretty simple tasks like that, but getting more powerful every day. Anything else in the chat, Justin?
Sabrina, do we know if we will be able to build, quote, Power Automate solution? Could you elaborate a little bit more on your question, Sabrina? And a quick clarification from Christine, is Product Advisor the same as Process Advisor?
Yes, Christine. Yes, thank you for the clarification. Yes.
Okay, good. And then Bert has a question. Any tips on efficient documentation of flows for customers or other power users?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have not found a tool that's perfect for this. That's why I think naming your steps, putting comments on your steps if needed, is a great option. Visio, I know someone mentioned Visio. Visio is a pretty good option if you're trying to build out a diagram visually. But that, yeah, there's no perfect solution for that I have seen.
Yeah, and that's also one issue that I have with flow is that if you have a lot of different flows in an environment, it sometimes is not very easy to keep track of them all.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that one way that you can help to deal with that is if you maintain like a single solution in your environment that contains all of the flows that are being used in that environment. It helps you to just kind of keep track of what all flows do you have in your environment that are actually running and doing things. Because otherwise, if you want to make an update to one specific flow, you might be digging around, oh, is it not in a solution? Is it in this one particular solution in this one spot? Things like that. So trying to at least put all of your flows into one solution, even if they're also in other solutions in order to move between environments, can help with just keeping track of what all you have going on in terms of flows.
Yeah, and it looks like we are seeing some ideas in the chat from other attendees, so those will certainly be ones that I will check out as well. One question I wanted to talk about, or one point I wanted to bring up is, as Nick mentioned, as we were looking at the triggers for the Common Data Service Current Environment Connector, that has since changed, as he mentioned, so thank you for pointing that out. It just shows how quickly this product is changing and evolving. And on that same note, I took a look yesterday and found that there were 11 new connectors created in February, in the last month. So that just gives you an idea of how quickly this product is being enhanced and added to.
Okay. Sorry, Nick asked, sorry if this was already addressed, but what licensing includes premium connectors versus free only?
Yes, great question. So yeah, a lot of stuff is changing, especially as it relates to licensing. I would just direct you to the Microsoft documentation on licensing, because it's pretty complex. It's not something that I would call myself extremely knowledgeable in, especially because I know it changes seemingly every week. So yeah, I would just direct you to the Microsoft documentation on that. I dropped a link in the chat for flow licensing from Microsoft.
Okay. Any other questions? Free premium. Yes, Heidi, that's also a good point. Some connectors have their own fees. So like some connectors are premium, like the CDS connectors, that you have to have like a subscription for Microsoft Dynamics in order to use, but then others are sold by third parties that you can subscribe to. And so those are going to have their own separate licensing requirements.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thanks for pointing that out.
Question from Bert, any assumptions on how Power FX might impact or be used in Power Automate, or am I way too soon on this? So Grant, how much do you know about Power FX?
I do not have any insight on that. Could we get some maybe elaboration on the chat?
So I know a very little bit about Power FX. Basically, it is the programming code that was used. It's kind of the basis of Excel too. Like a lot of your functions and things in Power FX are going to be the same as you would use in Excel. And it does have a lot of potential, it seems, for opening up things like source control for your Power Apps and your flows. But I definitely would like to learn a lot more about this topic.
Yes, that's right. I knew they were expanding some of that Microsoft Excel language, so that is something I do not know. I could certainly see that being integrated with Power Automate with these flows, but it's one of those things we'll have to wait and see what Microsoft does and how they can use that to make the Power Automate experience better.
Mm-hmm. And then Gina has a question: is there a limit on the number of workflows in a solution?
In a specific solution, as far as I know, there is not a limit. I've never added more than the solution has allowed. So I'm not sure on that. Justin, have you ever run into that issue?
I have never run into an issue where I had too many workflows or flows in a single solution. I'm sure if you really, really want to break it, then you can probably find a way. But in terms of just like everyday use, I think it's very unlikely that you're ever going to run out of space in a solution for your workflows.
All right.
All right.
Anything else in the chat here?
Do you have any other questions, chat? We do have a good link from Christine on PowerFX. So definitely, if that is something that you guys are interested in learning more about, you should check out the link from Christine. I do think that PowerFX is going to be becoming more and more relevant to those of us who are building and using flows in the very near future. And so I'm really excited for that.
All right. Well, if there are no further questions, I think we'll wrap it up here. Thank you all again for joining, and thank you for all the great questions and participation in the chat. Thank you again to Justin, and thank you to DynamicsCon. Have a great day, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.